Welcome to our second lecture in which we're going to discuss performance appraisals and training and development. In our first presentation, we talked about performance criteria and standards and kind of an overview about performance appraisals more generally. Now we're going to discuss the performance appraisal process and feedback on the performance. So let's begin. As we said in our first presentation, there is the real need to be consistent, and that means that more than one set of eyes needs to evaluate and to review appraisals before they are given to the employee. It doesn't need to be just that one supervisor consistently appraises his or her staff, but that across a department or a unit, the appraisals need to be consistent. If X behavior results in a decline in appraisal, then that needs to be consistent, at least for everybody who does that same job in the same unit, who have approximately the same job responsibilities. We've already talked about the need to avoid retaliation. The fact that a person has complained about someone or some situation at work shouldn't impact a person's appraisals at all. Now, it is true that only certain types of complaints are legally protected from retaliation, but it's still not a good idea, even when it would be legally okay to quote unquote retaliate against somebody. For example, if I complained about a coworker because that coworker had body odor, maybe that coworker is a friend of my supervisor's and my supervisor was offended that I did that. There's no protection legally for me because I complained about my coworker's body odor, but it wouldn't be a good practice. For one thing, we don't want to live in a culture, in a corporate culture, where people don't feel comfortable making complaints, even if they aren't for a protected reason. The second is that while that isn't a protected reason to make a complaint, most employees don't make those fine distinctions. They think of a complaint as a complaint as a complaint. And so if they hear that I got criticized for complaining about body odor, they may feel uncomfortable raising a concern when they have a concern, say, about sexism or racism or sexual harassment. So it's important not to retaliate no matter what the initial type of complaint may have been. We'll talk about layoffs in a different presentation in more detail, but I do want to touch on that. Most of the time when an organization is going through a layoff, they have some type of criterion or criteria to decide who is going to stay and who is going to go. They may have a goal, for example, everybody in the technician function, maybe they currently have 1,000 people in that function. They need to get that number down to 900. Well, they need to have some process for severing the 100 people. There's so many different ways of doing it, and organizations have lots of different factors in that equation. And usually they will have their legal department or the HR department crunch various strategies for accomplishing that. For example, they might dismiss the last 100 hires. And so it is a last in, first out, a LIFO type system if you're into an accounting model of the world. The nice thing about that system is that it's pretty bulletproof from a claim perspective, especially when the number of people affected is so significant, because it can be consistently applied. There's really no kind of discretion involved in it. And because the number is so large, any one of the 100 would be hard pressed to say, well, that was just, they use this tool because they knew it'd get rid of me. Well, you don't get rid of 100 people just to get rid of one person. And so when you're talking about, a significant population, say over 10, you're probably going to be safe doing that. Many organizations, though, choose not to do that for a couple of reasons. One is that many times they're more recent hires or they're more diverse candidates, and they want to attract and retain more diverse candidates. So in a traditionally male position, for example, many of the more recent hires may be women, or in a position that has traditionally had white incumbents, maybe the company has made some headway in attracting Hispanics or African Americans or Asians to the position. And of course, if they let go the 100 most recent hires, it's very likely to decimate that population. So for those reasons, sometimes organizations don't want to do kind of a LIFO approach. Another reason that organizations don't want to do that approach can be that sometimes the more recent hires are the more highly skilled, are the more enthusiastic, are the smartest. I mean, there's the people that have been in a position for a while may be brilliant as well. But think about it. Let's assume for a second this is an entry-level position. And so if you think about it, maybe the average length of time people who are movers and shakers, ambitious, smart people, the average time that people in that situation would stay in this job, we'll say, is 5 years. If you're kind of a middle of the road, excuse me, middle road person, not particularly great, but not bad either, you may stay in that position 10 years. If you're not so great, but not so bad you need to get fired, you're probably never going to get promoted out of that job. Well, let's imagine you have 1,000 people in that job. So the people from 0 to 5 are going to be a mix of all of those populations. You're really awesome people. you're perfectly fine people, but not all stars. And then you're mediocre to weak performers. The people that have been in your organization between 5 and 10 years are going to be primarily your perfectly fine performers, but not all stars, and your weak performers. The ones who have been in that position for more than 10 years are going to be your weak performers. So you can see, and let's say of your 1,000, 500 are in the first 500, or the first 5 years. We'll say 400 are between 5 and 10 years, and 100 are there for longer than 10 years. Well, if you get rid of the 100 most recent hires, then you are getting rid of, you're reducing that 0 to 5 population by 20%. And keep in mind, that'll be 20% of your best performers in that particular position. So you can see why organizations don't want to dismiss the most recent hires. Now, most organizations do dismiss the most recent hires. Let's say that this downturn in the economy was unexpected. There was maybe a world event, I don't know, pandemic or something like that, or perhaps your business lost a major customer and this loss was unexpected. And so you may have hired people into the technician position in the last 6 months, or maybe the last year. It's pretty common then to treat your absolute most recent hires, perhaps the people who are still being trained, and go ahead and sever them first. So let's say of our 1,000 employees, 100 of which we need to go, we can get rid of 30 because these are people that were hired in the last 6 months. In our organizations, after you've been in the position for 6 months, you're pretty fully trained, and there really isn't much improvement that's going to happen between 6 months and 5 years, for example. So now you still need to get rid of 70 more people because you've only severed 30 people. And again, you don't really want to just get your people from 6 months to, say, a year, and then, or maybe from 6 months to 2 years, because many of those people are going to be really, really strong. And so you're thinking of other methods to go ahead and dismiss them. I mean, you can use any method that you want. For example, you could pick people who were born in the month of January, or maybe January and the first 2 weeks in August to get to that. You might look at that and say, well, that's random, right? And it is random, but your goal is to have some mechanism that will allow you to eliminate the workforce that isn't discriminatory. And obviously no ethnic group or religious group or gender group is going to be more likely to have birthdays in January versus February versus March. The problem with that is that employees would understand firing the most recent hires, but they're really not going to understand you firing people just because they were born in January. It seems kind of bizarre, and so it won't be well received. Now, it's not discriminatory, so that's a positive, and since you still have 70 to let go, it's going to be very difficult for any of those January babies to say, well, the company really wanted to get rid of me, and this is all a farce to get rid of me. I don't think that's going to work either, but that would be a lawful strategy. Another strategy would be to look at the credentials of the employees and to say, well, Bob has been a technician, but he lacks the skills to ever be considered for the promotion. He only has an associate's degree, but in order to go to the next level, you have to have this particular licensure, and he doesn't have that licensure. Mary does have that licensure, so we're going to get rid of Bob over Mary. And as long as you're consistent and you let go of everybody, only people that lack that licensure, then that would be fine. Now, let's say you have 90 people who lack that licensure. Well, then you have to decide, well, between, since you only need to get rid of 70, how are you going to go about deciding which of those 90 you're going to get rid of and which 20 are you going to retain? You may at that point, if it's really that close, decide to separate them all. That might be a cleaner way of handling it. So there can be some kind of credential that you're looking for. It could be educational, it could be experience. Maybe Bob hasn't been cross-trained to do XYZ function, something that has a business connection with it. Obviously, you can't use race or religion or something along those lines as a criterion for this. But probably the most common tool to use to decide who to end or sever the employment relationship is appraisal history. And again, here there are tons of choices. You can look back to the last 3 appraisals. You can look back to the last 5 appraisals. You can look at the last appraisal. Most people don't look at just the last appraisal. The reason for that is that oftentimes the appraisers knew that there was a pretty good chance that there was going to be a reduction in force. And so they may have chosen appraisal ratings to protect some people who maybe weren't performing that well, or to put other people at greater risk who maybe were performing just fine. I can remember in a department I once was that we were only allowed to have a certain number of 1s, a certain number of 2s, a certain number of 3s. So what the manager would do was that they would assign, one person the 1 this year, then the next year, then another person would get the 1, and so forth. It was kind of this round robin approach. Well, you can see that system may work okay if you're looking at 5 years, but it's not going to work very well if you're looking at 1 year, because really it was random who got the 1 that year. The appraiser even admitted it. This is, Bob's year for the 1 or whatever. But if you're doing a reduction in force based upon the appraisal, well, Bob would be retained and everyone else would be let go, even though Bob may be the weakest of the performance in that particular department. So usually looking at one rating, the most recent rating is not a good system, especially insofar as you have a concern about avoiding the appearance or the possibility of discrimination. If you look back 3 to 5 years, again, most likely, most of those years, there was not a particular concern about a layoff. It's even a bonus if there was a different supervisor for part of that time. So you can show that more than one supervisor's appraisal was being considered in the mix. And so you might focus on the overall appraisal, and most appraisal systems have either a number or letter rating, oftentimes a 1 to 5 or a B, C, D, E, F system. And so you might take an average of those ratings, either the last 3 years, the last 5 years. So, again, if a person was rated a 3 1 year, a 2 2 years, and a 1 2 years, well, that would work out to be, what would that work out to be? That would work out to be about a 2, ballpark, maybe a little bit more than 2, or a little bit less than 2, but so that you could compare them. Or you might look at particular goals. For example, maybe you're really focused on sales, and within that appraisal, you may have sub-appraisals. So for example, Bob gets a 2 appraisal, but in terms of punctuality and on-time records, he's getting a 1. His sales results are really high. He gets a 1 there. His teamwork, he gets a low 3. And his paperwork completion, the quality of his paperwork completion is also a 3. Well, let's say right now your company is struggling. You need some people to go out there and generate some sales. And so you may not care so much about the 2 rating, the overall rating. You may be much more interested in the sales number that Bob has. Well, Bob has a 1 in that area. There may be another employee, Susan, who overall has a 2 as well. She has a 1 for attendance. She has a 3 for sales. Her sales numbers aren't great, but she's a wonderful coworker and she has wonderful paperwork. So she has a 1 3 1 1 versus a 1 3 1 1 3 3 for Bob. So overall, Susan's appraisal is slightly better. Her overall number is still a 2. But if you look at the numbers overall, you might say, well, Susan's the better performer. But again, what you're focused on is sales results. Bob is a 1 in sales, Susan is a 3 in sales. As long as you're consistent and you have a large enough population so that Susan really can't legitimately say, oh, they set up this crazy system just to get rid of me. So you're going to have, probably at least 10 people, maybe even a few more to make sure that you're insulated from that. It would be okay to look at some subcategory, especially when you can make a business argument. Well, right now we're struggling. Our sales are down. We're not so worried about attendance. We're worried about surviving as a company. And so that can be an effective strategy. I've also seen organizations that have a more complex appraisal system. So they might assign a number like a 2, and then some other number or a letter like promotable, or so that might be 1. There might be a best suited for a current position. There might be still learning job or something along those levels. And so you might even consider a 2 with a promotable to almost be like a 2+. This person's ready for more responsibilities. A 2 best suited might be somebody who's not going to get promoted, but maybe is as good as the 2 promotable in the day in, day out aspects of the job. Now, lots of things can play into these letter components. For example, it might reflect what this person's personal goals are. That employee might say, I don't really want a promotion. I'm happy doing what I'm doing. It's in my comfort zone. It's what I want to do. Well, if that person had been interested in a promotion, that person might well have been tagged as promotable because he or she was doing a good job. But this person doesn't want a promotion, so presumably they're best suited for the current job. Another thing that can affect a person's promotability rating can be whether they're able to relocate. Let's say this is a business that has lots of locations. Perhaps to be promotable, the expectation is you have to be willing to relocate. A person who's unwilling to relocate may be tagged as best suited for a current position. A third factor, again, can be if you're new to this particular job. You've only been in it a year. Usually people don't, for this particular position, there really isn't consideration of promotion for at least 3 years out. So you're automatically going to be best suited for your first couple of years. And so in that situation, using those letter designations can be very helpful for deciding who you're going to promote. A report can be generated with everybody who has a promotable rating, but it's not so useful for deciding who you're going to lay off under certain circumstances. So those are some things to consider. And again, when you're doing the number crunching, you see here, you're going to consider severing. You're going to probably run lots of different scenarios. See, well, what the numbers look like if we go with this plan, what the numbers look like when we go with this plan. Then you're going to do some statistical analysis to see if there is a disparate impact. Remember, we talked about disparate treatment and disparate impact earlier. Well, you may well at this time evaluate, well, the people that you're letting go, do they seem to be disproportionately a particular race or a gender, a particular age? Usually age gets a pretty hard hit in these areas. And that makes sense because if you think about it, most of the times, most of the layoffs are going to occur in the lower ranked positions. After all, that's where the body count is, so to speak. Well, if you're still in a lower ranked position and you're a more senior or you're an older person, it probably means you're not the hot shot. You're not the person who's getting for the new promotion highly ambitious. And so your performance appraisals probably aren't especially impressive. That doesn't mean that there's age discrimination. Maybe the people who maybe you started in the company 30 years ago, and the people who are hot shots, who were go-getters, who were really ambitious, they've already been promoted out of this job and new people have come in. And so the current hot shots are going to be the people that were hired in the last 5 years. That's not you. You don't want to be that person, perhaps, if you're in those circumstances. And yet it would make sense for an employer to consider severing you simply because, you do your job, you do fine, but you're not being a superstar. You're not burning the midnight oil. You're not figuring out 20 different ways to make the department more efficient. So for that reason, there can be the appearance of age discrimination, even when maybe there isn't substantively age discrimination. Of course, you can also see discrimination based upon gender or race or any other characteristic as well. Employers sometimes, like as I said before, will sometimes manipulate performance appraisals. Now, this isn't something typically that these senior people in management want to have happen, but the line supervisors and the low-level managers may do that. They're friends with a certain person, and they know that person's had an especially difficult family situation. And so, if a person's between a 1 and a 2, but gosh, they've got a sympathetic story, maybe the manager gives them a 1 instead of a 2. Maybe somebody else is between a 1 and a 2 that the supervisor isn't as close friends with, maybe because they're different genders, maybe because they're different races. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything extremely hostile. It could just be they don't know as much about them. That person gets a 2, even though they're equally good as the person who got the 1. It's time for the layoffs. The 2s are toast. The 1s continue. That's a subtle type of manipulation that the supervisor has done. And again, shouldn't be done. We've already talked about who does who does the appraisal. It should be the direct supervisor, the direct manager of the person. This supervisor or manager is the one who directly oversees the work of the subordinate. So he or she is in the best position to evaluate the quality and quantity of the work. This is also the person who will be giving positive and negative feedback throughout the course of the year. This is the person who will be there when the employee has questions, requests additional training, has concerns. Now, I'm saying that supervisor writes the appraisal, but that's not really how it happens in most organizations. In most organizations, the first draft of the appraisal is something that the employee does himself or herself. This is especially true when the person is in a management position. The idea here is, especially when there aren't hard numbers to work with, you can't just pull a report and see how productive this person is. The manager isn't going to be the best person to give all of the specifics. And so very often the manager will say, here's the form, fill out the first draft, fill all the specifics in there. And so that's one of the reasons why when you are the person being appraised, it's a good idea, from the very beginning of the year to have a folder, either an electronic folder, or maybe even a manila folder you keep in your desk, where you drop all of your finished work product in it. You date it and you put it in there in chronological order, so you'll have a record of all of your work, because a year from now, when you're doing your appraisal, you're not going to be thinking about that work you did 11 months ago. Yes, you'll remember the work you did, the last couple of months, but 11 months is a long time. And so you can just pull that out and start talking about that more distant work and talk about it. And you can give lots of specifics. It will prompt various memories and various reflections. You may also want to keep a bit of a diary. You don't have to add something every day, but maybe every week you write some important things that happened. You may want to have an email folder on your desk where you keep compliments and attaboys and attagirls that you hear from clients and attorneys and coworkers, so that you'll have those available to share with your supervisor when it comes time to do the appraisal. If you don't put it in your appraisal, your supervisor is not going to know about it, and probably isn't going to add it to your appraisal. So this is really your opportunity to sell yourself. It's almost like your resume in a way. I mean, it's not getting a job, but it's your way of telling the story so that you can persuade your supervisor to give you the highest rating that's possible. And again, it's important to spend the time actually preparing it, but it's something in some sense you're preparing throughout the year. Let's talk about 360-degree reviews. Not all organizations do this. In fact, most probably don't. But it's a really awesome idea, and HR people love it. And it can be a very positive experience. The idea here is that everyone reviews everyone. I review my boss. I review my subordinates. I review my coworkers. Now, it may be that you don't review all of your coworkers. I mean, if you're in a department of 50 technicians, you're not going to review all 50. So there may be some system that's broken down that, the people in your little cubicle, or the people that are on your particular team are the people that you appraise. And the questions that you answer on the appraisal are going to probably be different. The questions that you answer with respect to your supervisor are going to be different than the ones you answer for your subordinate. If it's for anyone other than your subordinate, your answers are typically going to be anonymous. Depending upon the number of employees, it may or may not be obvious if you give comments what those who actually wrote those comments. But this is a very good way for the supervisor and the coworkers to get a fresh insight as to how they're viewed. We all have blind spots as to how we're perceived. I think back to the television show The Office with Michael Scott, who was played by Steve Carell. He used to say the craziest things, about how, he thought everybody loved him in the office. Well, not everybody did love him in the office. And so sometimes people don't have a realistic view of how they're perceived. This can be an opportunity for those individuals, be they higher in the organization or lower in the organization, to get an insight. It can also be helpful for people higher in the organization to get a new perspective. So let's say you have a subordinate, let's say you're a senior manager, and you have a supervisor who you think is awesome, but he has 20 people reporting to him, and his 20 direct reports don't think highly of him, have a very significant amount of negative feedback. Well, that should affect how you view him, honestly, because, it's not just one or two bad apples here. That many people not liking the supervisor indicates there's some morale issues. And you want to read them and see if they're fair and look into them in more detail and perhaps give some coaching to that supervisor. Now, of course, if the supervisor only has 3 people reporting to him or her, it's not perhaps as meaningful, the overall number, but the comments that you get may give some insights. Or let's say the appraisals are generally good, except when it's about feedback, and all 3 of the subordinates say that Bob, the supervisor, does not give regular or consistent feedback. Well, that's something to bring to Bob's attention and to let Bob know this is something he needs to start doing more of. So 360-degree reviews can be a very effective tool to really find out strengths and weaknesses and to get that communication going. It can also be very empowering to the subordinates. They suddenly get a voice. It's a little bit like students who get to appraise or write evaluations for their instructors in college. Similar idea. So what should go into the contents of appraisals? And of course, there will be typically some kind of rating system, but there will also be an opportunity for lots of comments. So if a number is poor, probably any number needs to be explained somewhat. But especially if a number is poor, there needs to be a comment section explaining why the number is poor and explaining how that number can and should be improved upon, what the expectations are, what training options there are, whatever tools the employee needs to make those performance adjustments. So the appraisal should not be all sweetness and light. There should be some constructive feedback. But of course, the tone should be professional and measured. It should be, the tone should be consistent with the tone of the other appraisals. Now, obviously, for your best performers, there's going to be fewer negative comments than for your weaker performers. So I'm not saying there has to be an equal number of negative comments for each worker, but they have to sound like they're coming from the same measured professional person. Again, you don't want to use extreme language. That is likely to suggest some type of hostility. So things like you're the worst technician ever, or you can't do anything right, or you never meet a deadline. Words like that, extreme words, are usually not factually accurate, and you definitely want the information on the appraisal to be factually accurate, and also could be a source for a discrimination claim or even a defamation claim under certain circumstances. Although appraisal language is usually going to be subject to a qualified privilege for defamation situations. Again, as I said, you ought to have some positive and some negative comments. Having the positive is not some kind of magic pixie dust that protects you from unfair negative criticism, but it does show that you weren't beating up this person completely. It shows a balanced approach, which is likely to make it seem like there is less possibility of discrimination. We've already discussed forced distribution methods. That's when a particular department can only have a certain number of ones, a certain number of twos, a certain number of threes, and so forth. If you haven't already put this into your Quizlet, please do so. The employer require that the employer place a predetermined percentages of employees into particular performance categories. As you can imagine, these are very, very unpopular with employees. They're usually quite unpopular with supervisors, but they can address the problem that exists in some organizations of rating inflation. Everybody's getting ones. Well, if they're not allowed to give ones all the time, then they're going to be more of a balance. Assuming that, again, you don't have a system where, okay, it's Bob's year to get a one, you'll get a one next year type thing. You can have a more meaningful discussion about performance. These have been popular at times. They kind of come and go out of popularity. They can be the source of challenges. They in and of themselves are not unlawful, but if you happen to give, again, you're following the percentages, and let's say in your particular department, you have the ability to give 2 1s, 5 2s, and 10 3s, and maybe you have you need to give 2 people either 5s or 4s. Well, it may be that your 2 1 choices are pretty obvious, but your 2s and 3s, those 15 people, are all pretty much at the same level of performance. And so it's really hard for you to find a drawing line between the 5th best and the 6th best in that category to give 1 a 2 and 1 a 3. And if it just so happens that the way you separate it results in the African American becoming a 3 and the person who's getting the grade just above that, but really isn't any better, let's say that person's not African American, then that opens up to when the African American files a charge and says, well, my comparator is Bob the Caucasian, he got a 2, I got a 3, our performance is the same. The employer is going to have a difficult time defending that. So forced distributions can present kind of that indirect problem. Let's talk about feedback on appraisals. So obviously the whole appraisal writing process is going to ultimately result in a face-to-face meeting, almost always, although I guess there could be times like pandemics or when an employee works remotely where they can be done by Zoom or something along those lines. The employer should allow the employee adequate time to review the appraisal. Many times it's distributed to the employee before the actual appraisal, so the employee has the opportunity to review it, think about it, kind of handle the emotions that might be related to it. Then there should be a discussion about both the positives and the negatives. It doesn't have to be a long meeting, but there ought to be some discussion of both. I think that's a good idea for the employer to start with the positives. This is what we've seen here. This is really good that you do this, and to at least include one negative in the discussion. And if there's enough positives, to end with a positive. So kind of have a positive sandwich. Positive, 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 negative, negative, positive, something along those lines. You want to allow the employee an opportunity to respond to the appraisal generally, as well as to specific points that are discussed. It's also possible to have some kind of appeal process. It can be a very formal process where the person can actually kind of submit a document for appeal, or it can simply be that the employee writes a rebuttal to the performance appraisal, and that is included in the appraisal itself. Appraisals can be emotional experiences. I've had many appraisals where I've covered with an employee where the employee has become emotional, crying, upset, angry. That's a natural human reaction. That's one of the reasons why it's kind of a good idea to allow the employee to view it ahead of time so that he or she can work through the emotions. Appraisal should always be handled in a confidential place, especially if the thought is that this appraisal is going to be difficult, to handle it at the end of the day so the employee has the opportunity, to leave if he or she has been upset without having to go back to work when all the emotions are kind of up and upset. In particularly difficult appraisals, it can be a good idea for the manager to also have a witness present. Because if the concern is that this employee might say something happened during the meeting that really didn't, you want to have another set of ears who can be a witness. This person can be from HR, or maybe it can be another supervisor. Some organizations require that there always be two people from management in each one of the appraisals. It uses up a lot more of the workers in that sense. A lot more managers are kind of stuck going to these meetings. But the positive with doing that is that you can be consistent. But if, on the other hand, 90% of the appraisals is just the supervisor and the employee, and then you have a few where there's also someone else present, it certainly creates the impression that there's some hostility and tension in that situation. So that can be a negative aspect of that situation. Again, one of the secrets to doing appraisals is to set it up so that there are no surprises. In fact, when you're having those regular 5-minute discussions with the employee, you can say, hey, this will be something I'll need to put in your appraisal. You can be that candid with the person. I've talked to you 2 times already about this. This is the third. So now I will be putting this in the appraisal. I'd like to also add that this is something you've been working on and has shown improvement. So help me be able to add that to the appraisal. Let's talk about PIPs, Performance Improvement Plans. Organizations have different neat names for this, but PIP is too far there, is a pretty common name for it. So this is, I guess this is the definition I would encourage. An employee receives performance outcomes that he or she must attain over some period of time, usually pretty short, with negative consequences if he or she does not attain it. And usually the negative consequences is termination. Sometimes it's demotion, but usually termination. And the time period, it's going to vary from position to position, but typically 30, 60, or 90 days. And again, what time period is appropriate is going to turn on things like the length of service of the employee and the complexity of the job. If a person really just doesn't seem to know how to do the job, then there may need to be some training interventions. And so it may not be fair to do it on 30 days unless the goal is just to get the person retrained in 30 days. But if you're also expecting to see the improvement in the work, then you may need more time. If the situation is that the person just needs to be more productive at work, they need to make more widgets an hour, but they know how to do it, they're just not focusing enough, well, then a 30-day period of time may be a very reasonable approach. You can also have a system where there's check-ins at each one of these points. So let's say the goal for this employee is to manufacture 20 widgets an hour. And you might say, well, at the end of, right now they're doing 10 widgets an hour. At the end of 30 days, we expect, Bob to be at 14 widgets an hour. At the end of 60 days, we expect him to be at 17 widgets an hour. And at the end of 90 days, we expect him to be at 20 widgets an hour. This gives some flexibility to the employer because if Bob isn't showing significant progress at the 30-day point, let's say he's only at 12 widgets an hour, then depending upon the wording of the PIP, the employer may be able to dismiss Bob at that particular time. So you want to make sure it's not a contract, but it's kind of like a contract in that you want to make it clear to Bob what the consequences are going to be of missing various deadlines. So we've completed the performance appraisal section. We've talked about performance criteria and standards, the performance appraisal process, and feedback on performance. And now we're going to discuss training and development. Those two terms are obviously very closely related. Training is usually kind of the more formal process where you have somebody who actually goes to a particular classroom or conference room and somebody's in the front of the room talking. It's a more formal system. Oftentimes, various trainings are noted in a person's performance record. Development can be a more informal process where you are informally mentored by somebody, where you are given opportunities to kind of stretch yourself and go beyond your normal job responsibilities in a way that may not technically be you're not receiving direct training on it. You're training by experimenting with various approaches. But again, oftentimes the two concepts can be combined. So training and development programs obviously are designed to make that particular employee more productive, more valuable to the employer, and also to help them advance in their careers with that particular employer. It can also be positive for the employee. The employee may be more interested in staying with an employer that is interested in developing his or her skills. Of course, there's always the possibility that you train somebody well and then they leave. One very popular part of JCPenney's culture was that one of our most valued store managers that we trained up was Sam Alton, and he left us to start his own business, which obviously became fabulously successful. You can never probably keep people like Sam Alton because of his real genius for retail, but you can see why JCPenney would have sat back and thought, what could we have done differently? What could we have done to keep somebody like him or the next Sam Alton to keep him or her in our organization? So training and development should be a positive for an organization, but it does have the potential to mean that you're training your competition's next employee. Generally speaking, there aren't a lot of things that an employer is required legally to train its employees regarding, but certainly OSHA can be an area where training is necessary. And while it's not legally required to train about sexual harassment, after the Farragher and Ellerth cases, it's such an obvious good idea that it comes pretty darn close to being a requirement. There can be other industry-specific things that you need to train about, obviously often related to OSHA. And there can be lots of different categories of reasons. I can remember when I was at JCPenney, there was a move to train us in being more like business people. We learned all about return on investment, return on equity, and we had several different presentations on this. We actually played a board game, things along those lines to show us how it worked. Then it kind of went out of favor, so we never really did much with it beyond that kind of initial thing. But the idea of it, or the idea of having certain topics where everybody is kind of learning about what this means, can be very helpful to an organization. It allows an organization to develop a vocabulary within itself. It allows that organization to have a shared sense of expectations and to advance the culture. Many organizations have diversity programs where employees go maybe for a day or two or three or half a day or whatever, once a year to discuss diversity topics and to receive training in diversity. These can be controversial, but they can also be very effective at getting people to feel like they're valued within an organization. And from time to time, it can even open people's eyes to concerns that exist in the workforce. Obviously, training is expensive, both in terms of the cost of having the training as well as taking someone out of their productive working role to go to the training. So those are not trivial expenses, and deciding who gets to go and who doesn't get to go is a major concern, and how those aspects are going to be financed are major concerns. So you want to be sure that you are that when dollars for that purpose are being distributed, the people who have control of those dollars are making sure that there is no disparate impact or disparate treatment going on in that context. And of course, you can't say, well, Bob's 55 years old. We're not going to train him anymore because he's going to be retiring soon. We're going to spend all of our money training the 20 somethings and 30 somethings. No, that's not going to work. Until Bob tells you I'm retiring at X date and it's in the next 5 years, until he tells you that, you should treat him just as any other employee who is entitled to training. I mean, if he in his career trajectory, this is the appropriate time for him to have this training. If he were, say, 30 years old, then you ought to give him that training at 55. Of course, there's lots of reasons for training. We've already discussed the safety aspect, but also profitability aspect. For example, if you want to make sure that your assembly line workers are assembling the part most effectively, helping them understand how their work contributes to the larger goal can be very important in terms of morale. That they now some more feel like they're part of this larger entity, this larger organization. They may be more excited about going to work. They may feel like their work is more important. They may feel more included in the corporate process. It could also mean that they have more insights as to how it can be done better. Oh, that's why we do that. Well, have you ever thought about doing this instead? Oh my gosh, that's a brilliant idea. We never thought of that. So that can be a way to break through and get some innovative ideas. We've already talked about OSHA before, but just to know that there are needs to train people who are exposed to certain hazards, and so you have to be sure that you are conducting and documenting that training. Moreover, employees have a right to know about hazards on the job, and so you need to alert them to those hazards and give them access. Now, here's a definition that you want to add to Quizlet: hazard communication standard. This is the principle that the employee has a right to know about dangerous chemicals he or she encounters on the job so that he or she can take steps to prevent the hazards with it. And one of the big sources of having this information is going to be the material safety data sheets, DMSDS. You'll also want to add this to your Quizlet. Employers get this from the manufacturers for each hazardous chemical that is in play. And here's an example of an MSDS. This explains what to do. Oh, what if that chemical catches on fire? What do we do? Well, this will explain how are you supposed to put water on it? Are you supposed to smother it? Are you supposed to put some other chemical on it? What happens if this gets in somebody's eyes? What happens if it's released into the atmosphere? All of those things are really important for the people who are dealing with that chemical to know about. Also important for managers to have. Now, of course, no one's going to be able to commit this to memory, so this information has to generally be available. If a facility is large enough, you're probably going to have some kind of loss prevention or medical staff that will have that material immediately available, because obviously many times time is of the essence. Even if you don't have that kind of staff here and you're ending up calling the fire department, the ambulance, you'll want to get that information to those professionals so that they will know how to handle that situation when it arises. This is just an excerpt from one. Okay, so let's talk about other situations where training may be required. The Drug-Free Workplace Act, which is a federal law, does require that employers who are federal contractors provide some training about drugs. And specifically, you have to do these three things. You have to inform employees about a drug-free policy and the dangers associated with drug use. So you need to obviously have a drug-free policy. Then you have to tell the employees about it. And then you also, probably this will be in the same meeting, you should talk about drug-free policy, talk about the dangers of drug abuse. You may say, well, surely our employees know that already. Of course they do, but you'll want to confirm that. You'll want to keep a record of that PowerPoint or the handouts that you have. You want to take attendance, so you'll be able to prove to the federal government that you have complied with this requirement of the Drug-Free Workplace Act. You'll also want to advise employees about options for counseling, rehabilitation, and employee assistance programs. Many times these are called EAPs. Again, this would be part of that meeting where you discuss the drug-free policy. And you'll want to tell the employees about the penalties for drug violations. For example, if many of these companies will have some kind of drug testing program. So if you are found to have consumed some illegal substance, what's going to happen to you? Most of the time in these programs, termination will not happen the first time that the employee tests positive. An employee may be subject to suspension, or perhaps that employee will be given some other kind of consequence. Eventually, if the problem continues, obviously, then that employee is going to be dismissed. And usually if the employee tests positive, there will be some procedure where he or she will be periodically tested for some period of time after that to make sure that the negative result continues. When third parties are at risk, such as customers or vendors who visit the facility, or perhaps if your employee drives, and maybe just the general public, the employer does need to provide effective training to their employees to avoid claims of negligent training or negligent retention. So again, if you have an employee who's using drugs and the employee is driving the company vehicle from one site to another, well, obviously, if that employee is in an accident and injures, Joe Citizen out there, Joe Citizen probably isn't going to focus too much on suing the actual employee. The Joe Citizen is going to look at the deep pocket, the employer of the high employee. So now we've discussed the legally required training. Let's briefly talk about selection of trainees. So, it'd be wonderful if you had corporations had an infinite amount of money to offer training and an infinite amount of time to offer training. But of course, neither one of these happens. There won't be enough money to give every single employee every single training opportunity that he or she might want. Sometimes training is legally required. For example, for attorneys and doctors and nurses, they will need some kind of continuing education. Sometimes the training may be just essential to keep a person up to speed. For example, computer programmers are going to need to be updated on the latest softwares and things along those lines so that they will know how to effectively program and troubleshoot those types of tools. What the needs are in terms of training budgets are going to vary from department to department. But the training dollars ought to be allocated in a reasonable way that gives access to the funds to the people who need access to it. It's certainly appropriate to link the successful completion of training to promotions and raises, especially when all appropriate employees are eligible to receive that particular training. Of course, much training is more informal, as we were talking about, more in the development category. If I'm newly hired to work at Chili's, I may watch a few videos, but probably most of my training is going to be maybe shadowing another server for a shift or two, or maybe just kind of launching myself out there and having somebody that I can run to as kind of my mentor if I don't know the answer to a customer's question. And so much of the training is kind of on the job, more informal training. That's still very important training and very valuable training. And so employers are wise to have a system set up for that so that people are given the responsibility for mentoring. And that can be really positive because let's say you're thinking about somebody maybe becoming a supervisor. Well, a good way to test them out is to have them be a mentor to a new employee to kind of get them acquainted with what the rules of the road are for this position. It can also be a good way to develop some good relationships between coworkers, and that can help you retain that new worker perhaps. There are apprenticeship programs out there. These are programs oftentimes that have some kind of classroom component as well as some kind of being a helper, an assistant to an experienced worker. For example, a plumber's assistant or plumber's helper, that type of role. Some of these are very long programs, formal apprenticeship programs. Some are more informal programs. In fact, we've had times where students in the paralegal program have used the internship program, where they have perhaps worked for a business while they are continuing their coursework, and the business is paying them to be a kind of an entry-level paralegal, in part because they know that this employee is continuing his or her legal education and getting closer to being completed with that training. And so there's a synergy there. And the idea is once the employee completes the legal education, he or she will be ready to become a full-fledged paralegal. So we see this kind of on a more informal basis, even within paralegal studies. So at this point, we've completed the program. This particular module, we've talked about performance appraisals and also training and development, specifically the legally required training, as well as how to go about selecting training opportunities and the trainees for those training opportunities. Let's explore some things you may want to keep in mind when you're working with your clients in these areas. So again, you want to make sure you have the systems in place that will ensure that your clients, all of its employees, receive at least one appraisal a year. One thing I haven't talked about, which I should at this point, is the idea of a probationary period. We've mentioned it a few times over the course of this course, but let me be a little bit more formal here for a second. Most employers have a period of time. Some have 30 days, some have 60 days, some have 90 days, some have 6 months. The amount of time can vary depending upon the employer, but the idea is that there is this probationary period. And during that time, the employer's ordinary rules about termination don't yet kick in. The idea is that at this point, neither the employee nor the employer has invested greatly in this relationship. And so if it just appears the employee just isn't working out, the employer is more free to dismiss without going through, say, progressive discipline. And typically at the end of this probationary period, there is an appraisal. And again, the probationary period is not likely to last a year. And at the end of that probationary period, the supervisor sits down with the new employee and says, we're retaining you or we're not retaining you, and giving you feedback on your performance, positive and negative at that point. And so that is another type of appraisal that is important to cover. And if you're going to have the probationary status, you do need to have a date that you close that down and say, okay, we're done. You're no longer probationary. You're still an at-will employee, but you're now just kind of a regular employee. And it doesn't have to be, if let's say this is a 90-day probationary period, you don't have to have that meeting exactly on the 90th day. But somewhere 10 days before or 10 days after that period of time. Supervisors and managers need to be trained how to write and present appraisals. This is not a fun thing, and many, especially entry-level supervisors, don't have a lot of experience writing, and so many times they need support from their manager or from the HR department to help them craft those, giving lots of examples, having lots of review, even role-playing the actual appraisal meeting to make sure that it goes as well as it can under the circumstances for everyone concerned. You may well be asked to have the role of training clients, managers, and supervisors about how to do that. Again, as you talk with them, you're going to want to emphasize objective, quantifiable measurements, and you're going to want to make sure that any hidden biases do not affect the appraisals. And again, these latent or hidden biases are oftentimes hidden from the individuals themselves. And so talking about those type of biases is an important part of helping those supervisors not bring those biases to the table when they're writing the appraisals. And finally, make sure that the employees receive the training that is appropriate for their job responsibilities and for any future job responsibilities that they may have. I hope that this presentation has been helpful for you. If you have any questions about the material, please don't hesitate to pop into my office hours. Always look forward to seeing students there. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. Take care.